Welcome to our final lecture on Virgil's Aeneid. We'll cover the events of the war between the Trojans and the Latins, all the way to its climactic, or perhaps anticlimactic, conclusion. First, we'll briefly cover Book 9, where the Trojans are put on the defensive while Aeneas is away. Then in Book 10, Aeneas will return with a new set of allies to turn the tide of the war. All-out war continues in Book 11, while in Book 12, Aeneas and his arch-nemesis Turnus finally face off to decide the fate of Italy. Book 9 covers events that are roughly simultaneous with those of Book 8. Aeneas is away from the Trojan camp seeking allies in Pallantium and Etruria. Turnus leads his Rutulians and Italian allies to attack the Trojan camp. The fierce fighting of the Trojans on the ramparts resembles that of the Greeks in the Iliad, struggling to defend their beachhead camp and ships against a massive Trojan offensive. Again, we see in the Aeneid a Trojan war in reverse. Men fight and die on either side, and at one point Turnus himself breaks into the Trojan camp, much as Hector did in the Iliad. He kills many men, but is ultimately cornered and forced to escape. Book 10 begins with a council of the gods on Olympus. Jupiter opens the assembly by asserting that the war going on in Italy was not meant to happen. He ultimately decides to let the war run its course without any divine intervention. The battles fought will be unlike the Iliad, where the gods help out their favorites. Jupiter concludes, quote, "Now, whatever the luck of each man today, and whatever hope he follows, Trojan or Italian, I make no choice between them. How each man weaves his web will bring him to glory or to grief. King Jupiter is the king to all alike. The fates will find a way." End quote. Jupiter sees this war as unnecessary, but decides to remain neutral in it, confident that the end result will be the same. Jupiter has no control over fate in the Aeneid. Back on Earth, the Trojans are still under siege by the Latins in their beachhead camp. But in the nick of time, Aeneas arrives with a fleet of 30 ships and thousands of men from a country in the north of Italy called Etruria. They joined Aeneas as allies in the war. As Aeneas comes ashore, he immediately begins killing enemy soldiers left and right in a classic Aristeia. Throughout the Aeneid, especially the second half, Aeneas is quite different from how he was in the Iliad. Bearing his new armor from Venus and Vulcan, Aeneas is an invincible killing machine. Virgil indulges in gratuitous battlefield violence typical of the Iliad. But Aeneas is not the only warrior who has an Aristeia. Pallas, the young son of Evander, also enters the fray and delivers plenty of carnage on his own. But Pallas's moment of glory is cut short when he faces Turnus on the battlefield. They trade spear volleys, and Pallas falls down dead. Turnus glories over Pallas's corpse, and strips Pallas of his sword belt and wears it as his own, and this is an important detail. It is here we should see some direct parallels with the Iliad. Aeneas promised Evander that he would look after Pallas, and when Pallas goes down, Aeneas takes his death very hard. Pallas is thus the equivalent of Patroclus, and Turnus the equivalent of Hector, who strips Patroclus's armor. Aeneas's reaction to Pallas's death thus resembles Achilles when he returns to battle in the Iliad, a reaction of uncontrollable rage, vengeance, and disregard for the warrior code. Let's look at some examples of how Aeneas's behavior on the battlefield changes as a result of Pallas's death. Quote, "And 4 sons of Solmul, fighters all, and the same number reared by Ufens. Aeneas takes them alive to offer Pallas's shade and soak his flaming pyre with captive blood." End quote. Aeneas's grief and rage after Pallas's death is so great that he is willing to take men alive as human sacrifices to offer Pallas at his funeral. Achilles does the same for Patroclus in the Iliad. Both warriors violate the bounds of civilized propriety under the influence of their rage. Here's another example of Aeneas's rage at Pallas's death. Quote, "And next he wings from afar a deadly spear at Magus, ducking under it, quick, as the quivering shaft flies past, and Magus, hugging Aeneas's knees, implores, 'I beg you now, by your father's ghost, by your hopes for rising Iulus, spare this life of mine for my father and my son.' Magus begged now more as Aeneas lashed back. 'All those bars of silver and gold you brag of, save them for your sons. Such bargaining in battle, Turnus already cut it short when he cut Pallas down. So the ghost of my father, so my son declares,' end quote. And seizing Magus's helmet tight in his left hand and wrenching back his neck as the man prays on, he digs his sword blade deep down to the hilt." End quote. Aeneas claims that, due to Pallas's death, the normal battlefield ritual of ransoming men for treasure is no longer valid. Achilles says just as much in the Iliad when another man falls to his knees and begs for his life. Achilles' refusal of the ransom was a key theme in the Iliad, but we also see here another contradiction in Aeneas. Magus appealed to the ghost of Aeneas' father in begging for mercy. We recall in Book 6 how Anchises advised Aeneas to spare the defeated as part of the duties of a proper Roman ruler. Here, Aeneas completely ignores his father's advice, and even claims that his father would have agreed with what he was doing in refusing to spare the life of a suppliant. Aeneas' ultimate objective, of course, is taking revenge on Turnus, but Juno manages to delay Turnus' fate by having him chase a phantom of Aeneas away from the battlefield and onto a ship that floats out to sea. Aeneas, in turn, keeps on killing Italians, including a captain named Mezentius and his son Lausus. By the end of Book 10, Aeneas and the Trojans have successfully driven the Italians away from their beachhead camp back toward the city of Laurentum. Book 11 begins with a truce agreed upon for both sides to burn and bury their dead. This includes sending the body of Pallas in an elaborate funeral cortege back to his grief-stricken father Evander. These are the somber scenes of the cost of war, and by many accounts an unnecessary war. The scene shifts, then, to the city of Laurentum, where King Latinus holds a council. Latinus is in favor of ending the war, making peace with the Trojans, and granting them land in order to found their own city. Many of Latinus' advisors agree with this plan, all except Turnus, who insists that the war must continue, and that the Latins have what it takes to defeat the enemy. Turnus is still more interested in his own glory than the needs of the greater good. However, the deliberations are cut off when forces of the Trojans and their allies attack the city itself, and so Turnus calls the Italian armies to arms and gets his chance to continue the war. Much of the second half of Book 11 is devoted to the exploits of the warrior queen Camilla, who fights on the Italian side. She and her squadron of female cavalry stand in as the equivalent of the Amazons who fought in the Trojan War. When Camilla was a baby, she was dedicated by her father to the goddess Diana, that is, the Roman Artemis, and thus devoted her life to perpetual virginity and training for warfare. Diana, indeed, watches over Camilla and her forces join the battle, and vows to kill any enemy soldier who kills Camilla. Camilla, riding on horseback, has her own glorious Aristeia before a warrior named Aruns manages to bring her down with a spear. Diana promptly sends the goddess Opis to kill Aruns with an arrow shot. The result of Camilla's death is that the Italian forces are driven back to the walls of Laurentum by the Trojans and their allies. They take shelter in the walls, and Book 11 comes to an end. Book 12, the final book of the Aeneid, begins much like the third book of the Iliad. Aeneas and Turnus agree to settle the war in single combat. But just as in the Iliad's duel between Paris and Menelaus, divine intervention spoils the issue. Before the duel is even fought, Juno speaks to Turnus' sister, who happens to be a minor goddess named Juturna. Juturna speeds down to the ranks of the Italian army and encourages one soldier to throw a spear at the Trojan enemy lines. This causes all-out war to break out. Aeneas, caught by surprise at the turn of the events, is shot in the leg and wounded by an arrow. This takes him briefly out of the action, allowing Turnus and the Italians to gain the upper hand. Venus magically intervenes in order to heal Aeneas' wound, and he is ready to join the renewed battle. Book 12 ends much like Book 22 of the Iliad, as Aeneas pursues Turnus across the battlefield. Like Hector running from Achilles, Turnus tries to run away from Aeneas until the gods decide it is time for the duel and the war to end. Watching the battle from above, Jupiter at last persuades Juno to accept fate and let the war come to an end. Jupiter promises Juno that she will be greatly honored and worshipped by the future Romans. All that Juno asks in return is that when the Trojans and Latins unite, that they keep the Latin name and the Latin language, and that the name of Troy be blotted from history forever. Thus we anticipate in Aeneas' final victory that the two peoples will unite, and that the Roman race is a hybrid of Trojans and Italians. This is sure to resonate with Virgil's readers who weren't born in Rome, but elsewhere in Italy. To be Italian and to be Roman were amounting to the same thing. Aeneas and Turnus finally face one another in battle, and it is clear who is the better man. Turnus tries to hurl a rock at Aeneas, but he hasn't the strength to let it fly far enough. Aeneas in turn wounds Turnus with a spear. As Aeneas approaches the wounded Turnus, Turnus has this to say, quote, No mercy, please, Turnus pleaded. Seize your moment now, or if some care for a parent's grief can touch you still, I pray you, you had such a father in old Anchises. Pity Daunus in his old age and send me back to my own people. Lavinia is your bride. Go no further down the road of hatred. End quote. Turnus brings up two things in this speech worth noting. First, his plea reminds us of Book 24 of the Iliad, when Priam asks Achilles to remember his father Peleus in order to seek Achilles' pity and have him ransom Hector's corpse. Also, by bringing up Anchises, we once again recall Anchises' advice to Aeneas in the underworld to spare the defeated and break the proud in war. Aeneas hesitates at Turnus' plea, and is prepared to spare Turnus until he sees that Turnus is wearing the sword belt that he had plundered from the body of Pallas, Aeneas' dear friend. Aeneas' reaction to this is what concludes the entire Aeneid. Quote, flaring up in fury, terrible in his rage, Aeneas cries, decked in the spoils you stripped from one I loved, escaped my clutches? Never. Pallas strikes this blow. Pallas sacrifices you now, makes you pay the price with your own guilty blood. In the same breath, blazing with wrath, he plants his iron sword hilt deep in the enemy's heart. Turnus' limbs went limp in the chill of death. His life breath fled with a groan of outrage down to the shades below. End quote. So ends the Aeneid in the very opposite way that the Iliad ended. Whereas Achilles gave up his rage and showed mercy to Priam, Aeneas disregards his father's advice and refuses to spare the defeated. Was Aeneas justified in killing Turnus? Because he was wearing Pallas' sword belt, was this an act of breaking the proud in war? Why does Virgil end the Aeneid with Turnus' death and Aeneas in rage? Is raw violence and merciless vengeance ultimately what it took to found Rome? What happened to Aeneas' pietas? What does this say about the regime of the Caesar Augustus? That it too was founded through blood and violence? Regardless of your interpretation, Virgil makes us realize that Rome was founded and refounded in blood.